echoes of a shattered past, whispers of an impossible future. The air around Julian Vance still crackled from the aftershock of recognition, his perfectly ordered world continuing its slow, sickening tilt. He'd seen her, Annelise Hayes, the woman who was a vibrant, painful etching in his memory, now standing across the Ashworth's manicured lawn, impossibly, undeniably pregnant. His business partner, Marcus Thorne, ever the oblivious opportunist, was already making a beeline for him, no doubt eager to dissect the networking possibilities of this lavish baby shower in the Evergreens. But Julian barely registered Marcus's approach. His gaze was fixed, drawn by an invisible current to Annelise, who now looked as overwhelmed as he felt. He had to speak to her. The carefully constructed dam around years of buried emotions was crumbling, and the flood was imminent. As he moved, the murmur of the ethereal city elite, the clinking of champagne flutes, the saccharine melody of a string quartet, it all faded into a dull roar. There was only Annelise. He saw the slight tremor in her hand as she reached up, her fingers brushing against a small antique locket nestled at her throat, a piece of jewelry he didn't recognize, yet it seemed to pulse with a significance that pricked at his awareness. And then, as he drew nearer, she turned. Her eyes, those same eyes that had once held galaxies of passion and laughter, met his. "Julian?" Her voice, a mere whisper, was the sound that finally shattered his composure. It was a melody he hadn't realized he'd starved himself of for 5 long years, a sound that ripped through the carefully constructed armor around his heart and threw him back, tumbling through time. The years rewound with dizzying speed. Annelise, a whirlwind of fiery spirit and boundless creativity, her laughter echoing in the cramped, paint-splattered studio she'd laughingly called her sanctuary. She was a dreamer from Millfield, a small town that clung to the edges of sprawling ethereal city, her modest upbringing a stark contrast to the relentless ambition that already burned in Julian, an ambition meticulously stoked by his parents, Victor and Eleanor Vance. They'd met at a chaotic local art fair, him reluctantly dragged there by a former colleague, her fiercely defending a provocatively abstract canvas. He'd been captivated, not by the art, but by the artist, her untamed dark curls, the defiant spark in her eyes, the way her hands, stained with paint, danced as she spoke of light and shadow and truth. Their courtship had been a passionate collision of worlds. Her vibrant artistry, so full of raw emotion and inspired by the vivid landscapes of her mother's distant South American homeland, was a language he didn't understand but was desperate to learn. He, in turn, was building Vance Capital, his fledgling investment firm, with a single-minded focus that was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. He'd come from less, seen his parents, Victor and Eleanor, pour their lives into a struggling local business, and he'd sworn Vance Capital would be an empire, unstoppable. Annelise had been his anchor, his muse, the quiet harbor in his relentless storm of ambition. Or so he'd believed. The cracks, insidious and deep, had begun to show. Anniversaries forgotten in the haze of late-night deals. Her pleas for connection, for a shared glance across a crowded room, met with his impatient reassurances that this relentless drive, this constant sacrifice, was for them, for their future. He remembered her voice, laced with a quiet desperation. "Julian, I feel like an accessory to your life, polished and displayed when convenient, but never truly part of the engine that drives you." He dismissed her fears, her needs, blinded by the glittering prize of success. The prestigious business school he'd attended had taught him strategy and conquest, not the delicate art of nurturing a heart. How could he have been so blind? The arguments grew more frequent, more bitter. His world was boardrooms and billion-dollar projections. Hers was color, texture, emotion. The chasm widened until it was unbridgeable. The divorce had been swift, brutal in its civility. No screaming matches, just the cold, hard finality of lawyers and signed papers. Annelise had walked away, taking her vibrant canvases and shattered dreams, leaving behind an emptiness in his perfectly curated penthouse that no amount of success could ever fill. He hadn't seen her since. Not once. Until now. The memory, sharp and agonizing, receded, leaving Julian adrift in the present, the manicured perfection of the Ashworths' garden party, a surreal backdrop to the tempest raging within him. He saw Marcus Thorne finally reach him, a jovial, clueless smile plastered on his face. "Julian, there you are. Thought I'd lost you in this sea of pastel. Come, come, Mrs. Ashworth is keen for you to meet her niece, the guest of honor, actually. Annelise Ashworth, I believe? Marcus gestured vaguely towards Annelise, who had stiffened, her hand still at the locket. A beat of silence stretched taut and agonizing. Then, Annelise's voice, clearer this time, imbued with a quiet dignity that Julian remembered, a strength that had always been her core. Actually, Marcus, she said, her gaze unwavering as it met Julian's. Julian Vance and I, we were married. The words, though softly spoken, landed like a perfectly aimed grenade. Gasps, hushed and scandalized, rippled through the nearby clusters of guests. Faces turned. Eyes widened. The polite murmur of the party fractured, replaced by a sudden, intense scrutiny. Julian could feel the heat rising in his own cheeks, the familiar iron grip of control slipping through his fingers. Marcus Thorne looked as though he'd swallowed his own tongue, his affable smile frozen in a rictus of shock and embarrassment. Oh, this was a disaster. A beautiful, heart-stopping disaster. Annelise, however, seemed to draw strength from the declaration. But the weight of their collective stares, the sudden, suffocating attention, it was too much. Her composure, so bravely held, began to fray. He saw the color drain from her face, her eyes darting towards the lush, verdant sanctuary of the estate's sprawling gardens. With a murmured, almost inaudible apology to no one in particular, she turned, clutching the antique locket as if it were a lifeline, and quickly moved away, a fleeting vision in a flowing dress, disappearing amongst the rose bushes and sculpted hedges. He saw her distress, her desperate need for escape. And in that moment, the multi-million-dollar deal he'd come here to secure, the carefully cultivated connections, the endless pursuit of more that had defined his entire adult life, it all meant nothing. Less than nothing. An instinct, primal and undeniable, surged through him. He had to follow her. He had to know. The questions that had erupted in his mind moments ago now roared with an unbearable urgency. Why was she here? Whose baby was she carrying? And that locket? Why did it suddenly feel like another piece of a puzzle he hadn't even known existed? Ignoring Marcus's sputtering attempts at an apology, brushing past the curious, avid faces of Etheria City's elite, Julian Vance, the man who always had a plan, the CEO who was the very definition of unstoppable, did the one thing he hadn't done in 5 long years. He followed his heart, striding towards the gardens, towards Annelise, towards a truth that he sensed, with a terrifying certainty, would change everything. The opulent garden, a riot of late summer blooms and meticulously sculpted topiary, offered a deceptive tranquility. He found her near a secluded koi pond, its surface shimmering like a shattered mirror, her back to him. Her shoulders were trembling. He called her name softly, the sound raw in his own ears. She turned, her eyes, those unforgettable eyes, filled with a universe of pain and a resolve that took his breath away. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken words, with years of regret and a future that was suddenly, terrifyingly wide open. He had to ask. He had to. Annelise Hayes took a steadying breath, her hand instinctively, protectively, moving to cradle the astonishing swell of her belly. The late afternoon sun dappled through the leaves of the ancient oak tree, casting shifting patterns on the koi pond's surface, but Julian Vance saw none of it. His world had narrowed to this one impossible point. Annelise, here, pregnant, and the unspoken question that clawed at his throat. "Julian," she began, her voice trembling only slightly, a testament to the iron will he'd once admired and later foolishly resented. "There's so much you don't know." He waited, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. "They're yours, Julian." Her gaze, direct and unwavering, met his. "All 4 of them." The words, quiet as they were, struck him with the force of a physical blow. 4? He stumbled back a step, the gravel crunching under his expensive Italian loafers, the sound absurdly loud in the sudden, roaring silence that engulfed him. Speechless. For the first time in his meticulously controlled life, Julian Vance was utterly, devastatingly speechless. His mind, usually a razor-sharp instrument dissecting markets and outmaneuvering rivals, was a maelstrom of disbelief. Annelise watched him, her expression a complex tapestry of sorrow, defiance, and a weariness that seemed to seep into her very bones. "Sit down, Julian," she urged, her voice a little stronger now. "Please, this isn't a conversation to have standing." He sank onto the stone bench beside her, though a chasm of unspoken years and unfathomable revelations yawned between them. 4. Quadruplets. His how? It was after, she began, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the shimmering water. After the divorce, I was broken. You were gone, building your empire at Vance Capital, and I was just adrift. Her voice cracked, and she paused, gathering herself. We talked about it once, remember? Years ago, before that big overseas business trip you took, about freezing embryos, a contingency you called it, in case the timing was never right. Julian's mind flashed back, a sterile clinic. Annelise, nervous but hopeful. Him, distracted, already thinking about the Hong Kong deal, the endless meetings. He'd seen it as a practical measure, another risk mitigated, another option secured. Like a diversified portfolio. He'd barely given it a second thought after the papers were signed, assuming those frozen fragments of a potential future were just that, frozen, forgotten. An archive of a life they'd never live. How wrong he'd been. Utterly, catastrophically wrong. I was so lonely, Julian, Annelise continued, her voice thick with unshed tears. The silence in that apartment we once shared, it was deafening. All I had left of us were dreams. And those tiny chances you'd so casually agreed to store away. She took a shaky breath. So I took a chance. I wanted a child, our child, a piece of the dream we'd once shared, even if the rest of it had turned to ash. He could only stare at her, a maelstrom of emotions churning within him. Disbelief, a sharp stab of guilt that was almost physically painful, and then an unexpected, white-hot surge of anger. Possessiveness. IVF? He finally managed, his voice raw, unfamiliar to his own ears. You went through with IVF without telling me, without my consent? Annelise's head snapped up, her eyes flashing with a spark of the fire he remembered. Consent, Julian? Did you seek my consent when you chose your ambition, your deals, your empire, over me, over us, day after day, year after year? Did you ask for my permission to make me a ghost in my own marriage? Her words were like shards of glass. I found out about the multiples. A shock, believe me, I never planned for 4. And for a moment, a fleeting, foolish moment, I thought about reaching out. But then I heard the whispers, the society pages in Etheria City buzzing about Julian Vance and his brilliant, beautiful fiancée, Serafina Frost. Her voice dripped with a bitterness that scalded him. What was I supposed to do? Arrive on your doorstep, a pregnant, divorced artist with 4 of your babies, and disrupt your perfect new life? Risk your rejection? Or worse, risk you trying to control everything, to manage my pregnancy, my children, like another hostile takeover? She shook her head, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. No. I decided to do it alone. I thought I was sparing them, sparing myself, the pain of being a footnote in your meticulously scheduled life. A footnote. The word echoed in the hollow chambers of his heart. Had he truly made her feel like that? He looked at her, really looked at her, the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the fierce protectiveness in the way she cradled her belly, the undeniable glow of impending motherhood that even her pain couldn't entirely dim. And a new emotion, one he hadn't anticipated, began to surface through the guilt and anger, a profound, almost terrifying sense of responsibility. And something else, a flicker of protectiveness for these unborn children. His children. You should have told me, Annelise, he said, his voice hoarse. Regardless of everything, I had a right to know. A right? She repeated, her voice trembling with the weight of old wounds. What about my rights, Julian? My right to a partner? My right to not feel like the last item on your agenda? You made your choices. You built Vance Capital on the foundations of our broken promises. She looked away, her gaze sweeping over the meticulously tended gardens of the Ashworth estate. I couldn't subject them to that. Silence descended again, heavy and suffocating. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but what could he say? Her accusations, though barbed with pain, resonated with a truth he couldn't deny. He had been an absent husband, an ambitious fool who'd mistaken the glitter of success for the warmth of true connection. He remembered now, with sickening clarity, that perfunctory conversation about the embryos. It had been just before he left for that extended trip to Asia, a deal that had cemented Vance Capital's place on the global stage. He'd been all business, clinical, detached. Annelise had been quiet, her eyes searching his, probably looking for a sign, any sign, that he truly wanted a future with her, a family, and he'd given her spreadsheets and projections. God, what a fool he'd been. He opened his mouth to speak, to apologize, to beg for, he didn't even know what. Forgiveness? understanding, a chance to undo the irreparable. But the moment was shattered. A crisp, confident voice cut through the charged stillness of the garden. "Julian, there you are." Both he and Annelise started, turning towards the sound. And there, framed by an archway lavorowed with climbing roses, stood Serafina Frost. Impeccable. Her tailored cream suit was a beacon of understated power, her dark hair swept back in an elegant chignon, her expression one of polite inquiry that nonetheless managed to convey a hint of impatience. She must have missed their scheduled call, probably something to do with the upcoming charity gala they were co-chairing, or perhaps the final details of their much-anticipated high society wedding. Her sharp, intelligent eyes, the eyes of one of Etheria City's most formidable corporate lawyers, swept over the scene before her. Julian, looking like he'd been run over by a freight train, his usually immaculate suit rumpled, his hair disheveled. And Annelise, heavily pregnant, tear-streaked, her hand protectively on her belly, standing a little too close to Julian for mere coincidence. The air crackled with unspoken questions, with the weight of a secret so monumental it threatened to consume them all. Serafina's perfectly sculpted eyebrow arched almost imperceptibly. The world seemed to tilt, the polite murmur of the Ashworth's garden party a distant, irrelevant hum. Julian Vance felt the blood drain from his face, Serafina Frost's presence a sudden, icy counterpoint to the inferno of revelation that had just consumed him. Annelise Hayes, his ex-wife, pregnant with his children. Quadruplets. It was a truth so colossal, so life-altering that it defied comprehension. He turned, his movements stiff, robotic, to face his fiancée. Serafina's voice, when it came again, was a silken lash, cool and cutting, breaking the spell of stunned silence that had enveloped him and Annelise by the koi pond. "Julian, darling," she'd said, her perfectly sculpted eyebrow arched with an unreadable expression as her gaze swept over Annelise's visibly pregnant form. "You seem preoccupied. Care to introduce me to your friend?" Safely ensconced in a blessedly private antique-laden study within the Ashworth sprawling mansion, a room hastily offered by a flustered Mrs. Ashworth who sensed a brewing society tempest, the dam of Serafina's composure finally cracked. Not with a shout, never with a shout. Serafina's fury was a far more terrifying entity. "Your ex-wife?" she began, her voice a low, controlled whisper that was more chilling than any outburst. She paced the length of the Persian rug, her movements precise, predatory. "Pregnant with your quadruplets?" Each word was a perfectly aimed dart. "And you neglected to mention this, Julian? When precisely were you planning to enlighten me? Before or after our vows at St. Damian's Cathedral?" Julian ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, his mind struggling to form a coherent sentence. How could he explain a reality he himself was still reeling from? "Serafina, I only just found out, minutes ago, before you arrived." He gestured vaguely towards the garden, the words tumbling out, a fumbling, inadequate explanation. "It's complicated. The embryos, they were from years ago. When Annelise and I were still married," Serafina finished for him, her voice devoid of inflection. She stopped pacing and turned to face him, her eyes, usually so full of sharp intelligence and affection, now glinting with a mixture of disbelief and a dawning, pragmatic fury. "Embryos, how wonderfully clinical. And now this situation lands on the eve of the Vance Capital Sterling merger and incidentally our wedding. Think of the scandal, Julian. My firm, the partners, my reputation. Do you have any idea what this will do?" Her mind, ever the lawyer's, was already cataloging the potential fallout, the damage control that would be required. This wasn't just personal. It was a public relations nightmare waiting to explode. "I know, Serafina, I know it's a shock," Julian stammered, feeling utterly out of his depth. He who could command boardrooms and navigate treacherous financial markets with icy calm was reduced to a fumbling mess. "But they're going to be my children. I have to be involved. I will be involved." The words surprised him even as he said them. A certainty, fierce and undeniable, was taking root amidst the chaos in his soul. Serafina stared at him, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. Disappointment? Contempt? Or perhaps a grudging recognition of a Julian she hadn't seen before. "Involved," she repeated slowly. "And Annelise, what role does she play in this new involved future of yours?" Meanwhile, Annelise Hayes, the catalyst for this seismic shift, had been gently ushered away by a kind, if somewhat overwhelmed, Mrs. Ashworth. She sat in a quiet, sun-dappled guest room, a cup of chamomile tea trembling in her hand, the antique locket cool against her skin. The confrontation with Julian, the sudden appearance of his elegant, powerful fiancée, it was all too much. Her carefully constructed composure, her resolve to face this alone, was fracturing. She was high risk, the doctors had warned. Stress was her enemy, and now stress was her unwelcome, suffocating companion. What would happen now? Would Julian try to take the babies? Would this Serafina Frost, with her cold eyes and air of command, try to erase her from their lives? The fear was a living thing, coiling in her stomach. The ensuing days were a blur of tense negotiations, not of business, but of lives irrevocably entangled. Julian, true to his word, began to navigate the treacherous waters of his new reality. His conversations with Annelise were strained, tiptoeing around years of hurt and the raw, open wound of their shared past. He listened, truly listened, perhaps for the first time, as she spoke of her fears, her needs, the precariousness of her high-risk pregnancy. He learned about the doctor's appointments she'd attended alone, the sleepless nights filled with anxiety, the quiet courage it had taken for her to embark on this journey. And with each conversation, a layer of his carefully constructed defenses peeled away, revealing a forgotten tenderness, a burgeoning empathy. He arranged for a private nurse, Elaine Holloway, a woman highly recommended for her discretion and expertise in high-risk pregnancies. Nurse Holloway was a godsend, calm and capable, her presence a soothing balm in the increasingly turbulent atmosphere. During one of Nurse Holloway's initial visits, as she was taking Annelise's blood pressure, her gaze fell upon the antique locket Annelise always wore. Annelise, acutely sensitive to every nuance in these fraught days, noticed a brief, almost imperceptible flicker of something in the nurse's eyes. Recognition? Surprise? It was gone in an instant, replaced by Nurse Holloway's usual professional warmth, but it planted a tiny seed of unease in Annelise's mind. What was it about this locket, her mother's locket, that seemed to draw such reactions? First Julian's uncharacteristic notice of it, now this. Strange. Despite the ever-present tension, Julian found himself increasingly drawn to Annelise. Her vulnerability was a stark contrast to Serafina's unyielding strength, yet beneath it lay a resilience that captivated him. He saw the artist he'd fallen in love with, the dreamer, now facing the most profound creation of her life with a quiet, fierce determination. Serafina, for her part, was not one to be sidelined. After a lengthy, private consultation with her esteemed mentor, Elias Thorne, a retired judge of considerable influence in Etheria City, and, as it happened, Marcus Thorne's older, far more formidable brother, she presented Julian with a pragmatic, if somewhat chilling, proposal. "We maintain the engagement, Julian," she stated, her voice crisp and businesslike, as if outlining the terms of a merger. "We present a united front. It's the only way to manage the inevitable scandal. We'll issue a carefully worded statement. Later, much later, we can reevaluate. As for the children," she paused, the words still sounding foreign on her tongue, "we will figure out a modern co-parenting arrangement, something equitable. A truce." A fragile, yet thin truce was formed. But the Ashworth estate, and later, the luxurious, discreet apartment Julian rented for Annelise near the city's best neonatal hospital, felt more like a battleground than a sanctuary. Annelise, despite Julian's reassurances, felt like a pawn in a high-stakes game, her life, her children's future, being dictated by the very public concerns of Julian Vance and Serafina Frost. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken resentments. Julian was caught in the crossfire, torn between his ingrained loyalty and public obligations to Serafina, the woman he was supposed to marry, and the undeniable, visceral pull towards Annelise and the 4 tiny lives she carried. His lives. There were moments, fleeting and precious, of near tenderness. Julian found himself lingering after bringing Annelise groceries, discussing potential baby names, a task that felt both exhilarating and terrifyingly real. Even looking at grainy ultrasound pictures with a sense of awe he hadn't known he possessed. He'd once dismissed talk of children as a distraction from his ambitions. Now the thought of them, of his children, was a burgeoning obsession. But these moments were always shadowed by Serafina's watchful presence, either physically there, during one of her stilted, carefully managed visits to Annelise, or simply an unspoken wait in the room when he and Annelise were alone. He'd see Annelise flinch almost imperceptibly when Serafina entered, or notice the carefully neutral mask Serafina wore when Julian showed Annelise a small kindness. It was an emotional minefield. The breaking point arrived on a sweltering Etheria City evening. Julian, Serafina, and Annelise were in Annelise's temporary apartment, ostensibly to discuss further details of the co-parenting framework Elias Thorne was helping to draft. The conversation was stilted, each word chosen with lawyerly precision by Serafina, each response from Annelise quiet and guarded. Julian felt like a spectator at his own life's implosion. He was trying to mediate, to soothe, but the undercurrent of resentment was too strong. Serafina was outlining a schedule for neonatal specialist visits, her tone implying that Annelise's current medical team might not be up to par. Suddenly, Annelise gasped, her hand flying to her abdomen, her face paling dramatically. She doubled over, a sharp cry of pain escaping her lips. Julian. Panic, cold and absolute, flared in Julian's eyes, eclipsing everything else. Serafina's carefully constructed plans, the looming scandal, everything but Annelise. He was by her side in an instant, his arm around her. Annelise? What is it? What's wrong? The pain, she gasped, her breath coming in shallow spurts. It's strong. Oh, Julian, I think it's time. The sterile calm of Annelise Hayes' luxury Etheria City apartment, a gilded cage Julian Vance had arranged near the city's premier neonatal hospital, shattered in an instant. Annelise's cry, sharp and sudden, ripped through the tense discussion about co-parenting frameworks and legal stipulations. The carefully laid plans, Serafina Frost's meticulously outlined schedules, all of it dissolved into the primal urgency of the moment. The babies were coming. Now. Nurse Elaine Holloway, ever the professional, was instantly alert, her calm voice a steady anchor in the rising tide of panic. Julian was by Annelise's side, his own heart hammering against his ribs, his mind a chaotic whirl. The wail of an ambulance siren soon sliced through the humid Etheria City night, a mournful cry heralding the dramatic arrival of 4 new lives. Inside the racing vehicle, Annelise lay pale against the stark white sheets, her hand gripping Julian's with surprising strength. Her eyes, though clouded with pain, held a flicker of fierce resolve. He held on tight, his own fear a cold hard knot in his stomach, whispering reassurances he wasn't sure he believed himself. This was it. The point of no return. Etheria General Hospital's emergency entrance was a blur of harsh fluorescent lights, urgent voices, and the sharp, antiseptic smell that always seemed to cling to places of crisis and hope. A whirlwind of doctors and nurses materialized, efficient and focused, sweeping Annelise into the controlled chaos of a specialized maternity wing. Quadruplets, they murmured, their expressions a mixture of professional calm and underlying tension. Emergency C-section. Of course. Predictable deliveries were a luxury not afforded to mothers carrying 4 tiny miracles. Julian, scrubbed and gowned in unfamiliar surgical blues, his face hidden behind a mask that did little to conceal the turmoil in his eyes, found himself ushered into the brightly lit operating room. He'd insisted, vehemently, he wouldn't leave her side. Not now. The man who had once prioritized boardrooms over birthdays now found himself utterly adrift in a sea of beeping monitors and gleaming steel instruments, his only anchor the sight of Annelise, vulnerable yet incredibly brave, on the operating table. He'd made a frantic, disjointed call to Serafina from the ambulance, the words tumbling out in a rush of fear and an inexplicable need for what? Her support? Her understanding? He wasn't sure. She arrived at the hospital shortly after, a vision of composure in her tailored suit, though Julian, even in his distracted state, noticed the faint tremor in her hands, the subtle tightening of her lips. Her expression was a carefully guarded mixture of concern and a deep, unsettling apprehension. She was directed to the sterile waiting area reserved for anxious relatives, a role she had never envisioned for herself, a role that felt alien and uncomfortable. Nurse Holloway, a calm and steady presence, moved between the operating theater, Annelise's obstetrician, and the waiting room, providing brief updates to a pale Serafina and attempting to coordinate the maelstrom of emotions. Inside the OR, time warped and stretched, each second an eternity. The air was thick with tension. the rhythmic beeping of monitors the only soundtrack to the focused, intense drama unfolding. Julian clung to Annelise's hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles, whispering words of love and encouragement, words he hadn't realized were still in him, words that felt more real, more vital than any business deal he'd ever closed. He watched, his heart in his throat, as the surgical team worked with practiced precision, their movements swift and sure. Then a sound, a tiny, indignant wail that sliced through the sterile air, shattering the tension like a crystal glass. Leo, their firstborn son. Annelise sobbed, a raw, gasping sound of pure relief, tears streaming down her temples. Julian felt his own eyes burn, a wave of emotion so powerful it nearly buckled his knees. One. And then in quick succession, 3 more cries, each distinct, each a defiant proclamation of life. Max, then Lila, then little Nina. A chorus of new life. Echoing through the operating room, a symphony of miracles. 2 boys, 2 girls. Perfect. The nurses, smiling now, whisked the tiny bundles away for immediate checks, weights, APGAR scores, oxygen levels. All 4 were small, impossibly small, yet the initial reports were cautiously optimistic. Stable. But they would need time in the neonatal intensive care unit, the NICU, their first fragile days and weeks spent under the watchful eyes of specialists and the glow of monitors. Julian, dazed, turned to Annelise. Her eyes, heavy-lidded with exhaustion, fluttered open, finding his. A universe of emotion passed between them in that single profound look. Relief, terror, and awe so immense it was humbling. "We did it," she breathed, her voice a faint whisper, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. He bent and pressed his masked lips to her forehead, his own tears falling freely now. "They're beautiful, Annelise," he choked out. So beautiful." The days that followed were a blur of hushed hospital corridors, the rhythmic whoosh and beep of NICU machines, and the roller coaster of precarious hope. The quadruplets, Leo, the stoic observer, Max, the feisty one already making his presence known, Lila, so delicate she seemed a porcelain doll, and Nina, the quiet, watchful one, lay in their separate incubators, a tangle of tiny tubes and wires connecting them to the machines that sustained their fragile lives. Each day brought a new milestone, a fresh wave of anxiety, a prayer of gratitude. Breathing unaided for a few precious minutes, taking a few milliliters of milk, maintaining their own body temperature. Tiny victories in a monumental battle. Julian Vance, the titan of Vance Capital, found himself utterly transformed. The cutthroat world of high finance, the multi-million-dollar deals, the relentless pursuit of more, it all faded into insignificance. His new reality was the NICU. He spent hours standing over their incubators, his large hands looking impossibly clumsy beside their miniature forms. He marveled at the impossibly tiny curve of Lila's ear, the determined way Max gripped his offered pinky finger, the soft, downy hair on Leo's head, the gentle sigh of Nina's breath. A fierce, primal protectiveness surged through him, an emotion so powerful it eclipsed everything else. These were his children. His. And he would move heaven and earth for them. His perfectly tailored suits were often replaced by comfortable slacks and shirts, his CEO persona shedding like an old skin, revealing the raw, vulnerable father beneath. Annelise recovered slowly from the C-section. She was sore, weary beyond measure, but the sight of her babies, the tiny, fierce sparks of life they represented, spurred her on. Julian was a constant presence, a surprising source of strength and comfort. He ran errands, fetched her favorite herbal teas from the hospital cafe, fluffed her pillows with an uncharacteristic gentleness, even managed to sneak in a ridiculously oversized plush giraffe that made her laugh through her tears. For a while, in the sterile, hushed world of the hospital, it felt as if they were forging a new bond, a strange, beautiful, tentative partnership, born of shared fear and an overwhelming, all-consuming love for their babies. Serafina, for her part, struggled to find her place in this radically altered landscape. She visited, always impeccably dressed, always bearing thoughtful, expensive gifts, tiny cashmere blankets, exquisitely crocheted hats, a silver rattle that seemed absurdly large for the infants it was intended for. Annelise thanked her politely, her gratitude genuine but tinged with an undeniable awkwardness. Julian, too, was grateful for Serafina's efforts, but an unspoken tension lingered between them, a chasm of what-ifs and what-nows. He sensed Serafina's unease, her growing displacement. She was a woman accustomed to being in control, to understanding the parameters of any situation. Here, she was an outsider looking in, witnessing an intimacy between Julian and Annelise that was both heartbreaking and, for her, deeply unsettling. She saw Julian tenderly adjust the blanket around a sleeping Lila, watched him whisper encouragement to Max as he struggled with his breathing. She saw him gently stroke Annelise's hair one afternoon, as Annelise wept with a mixture of exhaustion and relief after a particularly good report from the neonatologist about Leo's progress. These were moments of raw, unfiltered emotion, moments that forged a bond Serafina knew, with a sinking heart, she could never truly penetrate. One evening, as Julian and Serafina were leaving the hushed, dimly lit NICU after a long vigil, the scent of antiseptic clinging to their clothes, Serafina finally stopped him in the quiet, echoing hospital corridor. Her voice was low, heavy with unshed tears, her carefully maintained composure beginning to fray. "Julian," she began, her gaze fixed on some distant point down the polished hallway, "we need to talk. I can't do this anymore." She finally looked at him, her eyes shimmering. "Look at you with her, with them. You have a family now, a real one, forged in this crucible. Where do I fit, Julian? Where do I possibly fit into this?" Her question hung in the sterile air, heavy and unanswerable, a choice stark and unavoidable, laid bare before him. Julian Vance stood in the sterile silence of the hospital corridor, Serafina Frost's words echoing around him, a stark, unavoidable ultimatum. "Look at you with her, with them. You have a family now. Where do I fit, Julian? You have to choose." The choice, in truth, had already been making itself, solidifying in the crucible of the NICU, in the shared fear and breathtaking wonder of the past days. The final act of their once celebrated engagement played out not in a dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet dignity Serafina always possessed. Days later, in the hushed expanse of Julian's Etheria City penthouse, a place that had once symbolized their shared ambition and power, Serafina Frost gently placed the spectacular diamond engagement ring, a rock that had graced countless society pages, on the polished mahogany table. Its facets caught the muted afternoon light, throwing fractured rainbows onto the cool marble floor. "I deserve a love that isn't haunted by ghosts, Julian," she said, her voice devoid of accusation, merely stating a fact. "And so do you. We both deserve futures unencumbered by this." She gestured vaguely, encompassing not just Annelise and the Quadruplets, but the wreckage of their own carefully constructed plans. Her quiet exit, the soft click of the door closing behind her, left an echoing silence, a void where a future had once been. Julian stared at the ring, a multi-million-dollar symbol of a life now irrevocably altered. A wave of grief, sharp and surprisingly potent, washed over him. He had cared for Serafina, respected her intellect, her drive, her unwavering loyalty to their shared vision of success. Theirs had been a partnership, a formidable alliance, but beneath the grief, an undeniable, almost shameful sense of relief began to unspool within him, an unshackling. The path with Serafina, though glittering and secure, had perhaps always been one built more on strategic alignment than the messy, unpredictable, all-consuming force he was beginning to rediscover. His focus, now absolute and undivided, shifted entirely to Annelise Hayes and their 4 tiny, fragile children: Leo, Max, Lila, and Nina. Weeks later, after what felt like an eternity of hushed consultations, beeping monitors, and prayers whispered over incubators, the Quadruplets were finally deemed strong enough to leave the neonatal intensive care unit. It was a day of immense joy, tinged with a terrifying sense of responsibility. 4 impossibly small car seats were buckled into a specially outfitted van, Julian himself triple-checking every strap, his usual CEO confidence replaced by the nervous precision of a new father. They didn't return to Annelise's temporary apartment, nor to Julian's now empty penthouse. Instead, Julian had purchased a spacious, light-filled condo near Willow Creek Park, a sprawling green oasis in the heart of Etheria City. It was neutral ground, a sanctuary chosen for its proximity to pediatric specialists and its sense of quiet domesticity, a world away from the frenetic pace of Vance capital. Nurse Elaine Holloway, whose calm competence had been a lifeline in the hospital, agreed to continue assisting them, at least for the first few challenging months. The condo quickly filled with the paraphernalia of 4 infants. cribs assembled in a row, changing tables laden with nappies and wipes, mobiles spinning gently above sleeping and often wailing babies. It was chaotic. It was exhausting. It was life. But their newfound privacy was short-lived. The Etheria City gossip mill, already churning with rumors since the baby shower fiasco, went into overdrive. A tenacious paparazzi, tipped off by who knew who, snapped a photo of a weary but unmistakably doting Julian Vance laden with baby carriers emerging from the hospital's pediatric wing. The image, grainy and intrusive, was splashed across the front page of the city's most notorious tabloid, Billionaire Tycoon's Secret Quadruplets with Mystery Ex-Wife. The media frenzy erupted. Reporters camped outside the condo building. Helicopters buzzed overhead. Vance Capital's PR team, headed by a beleaguered Marcus Thorne, worked around the clock, issuing carefully worded statements, pleading for privacy, trying to spin the narrative from scandalous secret to heartwarming tale of unexpected fatherhood. It was a relentless onslaught. Julian, who had once courted the press for business advantage, now found himself fiercely protective of Annelise and their children, shielding them from the intrusive glare of the spotlight. He and Annelise, by necessity, presented a united private front. They were a team, bound by their shared love for their children and their mutual desire to protect them from the circus their lives had become. And in that shared purpose, something new and fragile began to grow between them. The reality of caring for 4 newborns was a baptism by fire. Sleep became a forgotten luxury, measured in snatched 20-minute intervals. Feedings were a relentless, round-the-clock relay. Nurse Holloway's expertise invaluable in establishing some semblance of a routine. The sheer volume of nappies was astounding. There were days when Julian, running on caffeine and sheer adrenaline, felt like he was drowning in a sea of burp cloths and baby formula. Yet, to everyone's surprise, most of all his own, he found a profound, almost shocking sense of purpose in the midst of the beautiful chaos. He learned to swaddle with surprising dexterity, to distinguish between Leo's hungry cry and Max's call for a cuddle, to soothe Lila's colicky evenings with a gentle rocking motion that he instinctively knew she preferred. He'd sit for hours in the dimly lit nursery, a tiny infant nestled against his chest, marveling at the perfect, miniature fingernails, the soft tufts of hair, the trusting way they surrendered to his embrace. The ruthless CEO of Vance Capital was slowly, irrevocably, being replaced by Julian Vance, father of 4. He began delegating more at the office, his once unthinkable absences from high-stakes meetings becoming more frequent. His board members were perplexed, shareholders murmured, but Julian found he cared less about the fluctuations of the stock market and more about the rhythm of his children's breathing. Annelise, too, found her footing in this new, demanding world. With Nurse Holloway's steady support and Julian's unexpected partnership, she slowly regained her physical strength. The trauma of the emergency C-section began to fade, replaced by the overwhelming love she felt for her babies. And tentatively at first, then with growing confidence, she returned to her art. Her small sketchbook, a constant companion, filled with images of tiny hands and sleeping faces, the play of light on a baby's cheek. Her larger canvases, propped up in a corner of the sun-filled living room, began to reflect the swirling emotions of her new life. Vibrant, chaotic, yet imbued with a profound sense of beauty and resilience. Motherhood, it turned out, was her most powerful muse. It was Elias Thorne, Seraphina's former mentor, who, in a surprising gesture of goodwill, perhaps prompted by a desire to see some order restored to Julian's life, if only for the sake of Vance Capital's stability, suggested they seek family therapy. He'd acted as a neutral, if somewhat reluctant, mediator during the initial fallout with Seraphina, and he saw the deep, unhealed wounds between Julian and Annelise. "You have 4 lives depending on you now," he'd said to Julian, his voice gruff but not unkind. "If not for yourselves, then for them. Find a way to heal the past, or it will forever poison your present." The therapy sessions were difficult. Raw. Annelise, hesitant at first, found her voice, unleashing years of pent-up pain and resentment, his emotional neglect during their marriage, her crushing loneliness, the feeling of being an afterthought to his all-consuming ambition. Julian, stripped of his usual corporate defenses, listened, truly listened, and the weight of his past failures settled upon him with devastating clarity. There were tears. His, hers. There was anger, accusations flung like stones. But slowly, painstakingly, there were also breakthroughs. Small admissions of fault, glimmers of understanding. The first tentative steps towards rebuilding a trust that had been shattered. They were learning to communicate, not as embattled ex-spouses, but as co-parents, united by a shared love for their children. It was a fragile peace, hard-won and fiercely protected. One quiet evening, weeks into this new rhythm of their lives, the quadruplets finally asleep in their cribs, a soft hum from the white noise machines filling the condo. Annelise was sorting through a box of baby clothes. Some new, some old things she'd lovingly packed away years ago, remnants of a dream she'd almost abandoned. Her fingers brushed against the familiar cool metal of the antique locket her mother had given her, the one she always wore. She'd been fiddling with it more often lately, its weight a comforting presence. Tonight, as she turned it over in her hand, her thumb caught on a tiny, almost invisible clasp she'd never noticed before. Curious, she pressed it. With a faint click, a hidden compartment sprang open. Inside, nestled against faded velvet, was a tiny sepia-toned photograph. A handsome man, with kind eyes and a gentle smile, a man she didn't recognize. Her breath caught in her throat. Who was he? She looked up to find Julian watching her from the doorway of the nursery, a soft, almost tender expression on his face as he observed her. He'd been checking on the babies. He did that a lot now. "Julian," she said, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes wide with a new, unsettling mystery. She held out the locket, the tiny photograph exposed. "I found this, in the locket, the one my mother gave me before she passed. She never told me who he was." The question hung in the quiet air of their Willow Creek Park condo. The faded photograph in the antique locket, a tangible link to a past Annelise Hayes hadn't known existed. "My mother was always so secretive about her life before my father," she'd murmured, her eyes, so often filled with the vibrant energy of her art or the fierce love for her children, now clouded with a vulnerable curiosity. Who could this be? Julian Vance had taken her hand then, a gesture of quiet support that spoke volumes of the ground they had covered, the trust they were painstakingly rebuilding. He saw not just a mystery to be solved, but another layer of Annelise's story, another path to healing that, this time, she wouldn't have to walk alone. And so, in the weeks that followed, amidst the beautiful, relentless chaos of caring for 4 tiny infants, they had gently prodded at the edges of that old secret. With Julian's resources and quiet encouragement, Annelise had pieced together fragments of her late mother's youth. The man in the locket, they discovered, was not a lost father or a scandalous secret, but her mother's first love, a poignant chapter from a life lived long ago in a small village in South America before war and circumstance had led her to a new land and a different future. Learning this small, human story of her mother's early heart brought Annelise a surprising sense of peace, a connection to the woman she had loved and lost, a quiet closing of an unknown door. It was another thread woven into the intricate tapestry of her own life, a life now so profoundly, unexpectedly, wonderfully reshaped. 6 months later, the ethereal city sun, now mellowed with the golden hues of early autumn, filtered through the leaves of the majestic oaks in Willow Creek Park. It illuminated a scene of quiet, unadulterated joy. The christening of Leo, Max, Lila, and Nina Vance. Gone was the frantic terror of the NICU, replaced by the soft gurgles and contented sighs of 4 healthy, thriving babies, dressed in identical ivory gowns, their wide, curious eyes taking in the dappled light and the smiling faces surrounding them. Julian stood beside Annelise, his arm resting lightly around her waist. No longer the ruthlessly driven CEO of the story's opening, a man perpetually chasing the next deal, the next conquest. This Julian was transformed. His face, though still bearing the distinguished lines of a man who commanded empires, was softer now, his eyes holding a depth of emotion, a quiet contentment that had been absent for far too long. He looked at Annelise, her own face radiant, reflecting not just the gentle sunlight, but an inner peace that had been hard-won. They were a united front, their presence together exuding a strength forged in the fires of past pain and present love. A deep, mature affection flowed between them, unspoken but palpable in their shared glances, the easy way they moved around each other, anticipating needs, offering silent support. Marcus Thorne, ever loyal despite his initial blundering introduction months ago, beamed with pride, every inch the doting godfather as he held a remarkably calm Leo. Nurse Elaine Holloway, whose temporary contract had seamlessly transitioned into a permanent, cherished role within their unconventional family, gently bounced a gurgling Lila on her knee, her smile as warm as the autumn sun. She was more than a nurse now. She was a confidant, a pillar of strength, a beloved fixture in the babies' lives and in Julian and Annelise's journey. And among the small, intimate gathering of close friends and the ever-supportive Ashworths stood Seraphina Frost. Julian had extended the invitation, a gesture of peace, of acknowledgement. Annelise had readily agreed. Seraphina, to her credit, had accepted with grace. She was different too, a subtle shift in her usual impeccable composure. There was a new softness around her eyes, a genuine warmth in her smile, as she presented a beautifully wrapped gift for the quadruplets. 4 exquisitely crafted silver music boxes, each playing a different lullaby. Her interaction with Julian and Annelise was respectful, almost gentle. There was no lingering bitterness, no unspoken recriminations, just a quiet acceptance, a sense of closure. She had, as she'd wished for them both, found her own new path, unencumbered by ghosts. Her presence was a quiet testament to the possibility of healing, of moving forward with grace. The simple ceremony under the ancient oaks concluded with heartfelt promises and shared smiles. The scent of turning leaves mingled with the faint, sweet aroma of baby powder. Later, as the small party moved to a nearby pavilion for a light luncheon, the conversation still touched upon Julian and Annelise's continued journey. They spoke openly, if discreetly, about their ongoing family therapy with Elias Thorne's recommended counselor. The work was far from over. Rebuilding trust, truly healing the deep wounds of their past, was a slow, deliberate process. They weren't rushing back into a romantic entanglement, not in the traditional sense. What they were building was something deeper, stronger, founded on shared parenthood, mutual respect, and an undeniable, rekindled affection that was all the more precious for having been lost and found again. Life with quadruplets remained an exercise in beautiful chaos. Sleepless nights were still frequent, though now punctuated more by the demands of teething and growth spurts than the anxieties of the NICU. Their spacious condo often resembled a beautifully decorated disaster zone, strewn with toys, half-empty bottles, and the detritus of 4 rapidly growing personalities. But it was a home filled with laughter, with the constant, joyful thrum of new life. Julian, much to the continued astonishment of the Vance Capital Board, had reshaped his world. Early morning feedings had permanently replaced early morning market analyses. He discovered an unexpected joy in the mundane, the sticky fingers clutching his, the surprisingly strong grip of a tiny hand, the cacophony of 4 babies demanding his attention at once. He learned to delegate, to trust his team, to understand that an empire meant little without a legacy of love to give it meaning. Annelise, too, was flourishing. Her art had taken on a new vibrancy, a depth of emotion that resonated with critics and collectors alike. Her canvases, once tinged with a melancholic beauty, now pulsed with the chaotic energy of motherhood, the fierce protectiveness, the overwhelming love. She painted with a newfound confidence, her studio a haven where she could translate the whirlwind of her life into color and form. As dusk began to settle over Etheria City that evening, casting long shadows across Willow Creek Park, the last of the christening guests departed. Back in their condo, a peaceful quiet descended. Leo, Max, Lila, and Nina were finally asleep, 4 tiny, perfect bundles tucked into their cribs. Julian found Annelise standing by the large window in the living room, looking out at the twinkling city lights. He came to stand beside her, slipping his hand into hers. "They're amazing, aren't they?" he said softly, his voice filled with an awe that still, after 6 months, hadn't faded. Annelise leaned her head against his shoulder. "They are, our little miracles." She squeezed his hand. "We're doing okay, Julian, aren't we?" He turned to her, his eyes meeting hers in the dim light. "More than okay, Annelise." He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "We're a family, imperfect maybe, a little unconventional certainly, but we're a family. Feeling? Then maybe, just maybe, something in this journey has touched your heart in a way words alone cannot describe. Because what we've just witnessed isn't just about a billionaire or a baby shower. It's about the raw, unedited, often messy truth of being human. It's about the pain of letting go, the courage to forgive, and the astonishing power of love to find its way again. Julian and Annelise's journey reminds us that healing isn't linear. It's uncomfortable. It's imperfect. And it often begins the moment we choose vulnerability over pride. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." And that's exactly what happened here. When Julian stopped fighting the external chaos and faced his own heart, he found something real, something lasting. This story asks all of us to reflect. What are we chasing? Recognition, success, or connection? Because all the boardrooms in the world can't compete with the quiet joy of holding your child's hand, and all the headlines can't match the whispered promise between two people choosing to try again. So, my wonderful friends, if this story stayed with you till the very last word, then I believe there's something inside you too. Something soft, strong, and ready for healing. Don't forget to like this video if it moved you. Share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances. And subscribe, because together, we're building a space for stories that matter, stories that heal. As Epictetus said, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. And maybe, just maybe tonight, we all chose to react with love. Thank you for being here. You are never alone.